Welcome back to Alien Love Stories. Tonight we ask, what if someone around you isn't who they appear to be, and you're the only one they trust enough to show what lies beneath? This is the story of a woman no one could explain, and the man who saw her for what she truly was. It started in a town so small it didn't need stoplights. Just a handful of buildings pressed between a wide, colorless sky and endless roads no one ever seemed to finish paving. I wasn't born there. I wasn't meant to stay, but life, in a few bad choices, had a way of making nowhere feel like home when everywhere else became too loud. I kept to myself, a studio apartment above a closed bookstore, one old camera, half a dozen worn-out lenses, and a part-time gig photographing weddings and broken machinery. And then she arrived. She didn't come with a storm. There were no fireballs or lights in the sky, no sirens, no missing time. She simply walked into town one Thursday morning, and nothing was ever the same again. I first saw her through my viewfinder. I had been asked to shoot stock photos for the town's tourism board, which was ironic considering we had no tourists. So there I was, standing on Main Street, capturing shots of bricks and faded paint and signs no one read anymore. And then, click. I didn't mean to press the shutter. It just happened. She was standing across the street, backlit by the sun, perfect posture, dark coat, hair too smooth for this wind, eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. And just for a second, she looked directly into the lens, like she knew. Not that I was photographing her, but that I was about to remember her forever. She didn't move like the rest of us. That was the first thing I noticed. She wasn't slow. She wasn't fast. She was timed. Like her movements obeyed a rhythm no one else could hear. She didn't blink, didn't fidget, didn't glance at her phone or squint at the sun. She just stood, waiting. For what, I didn't know, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling after I lowered the camera. I told myself I wouldn't follow her, that I wasn't one of those people. But 5 minutes later, I found myself 2 blocks behind her, pretending I just happened to be going the same way. She walked into the only cafe in town, didn't look around, didn't ask for a menu, just sat at the far booth, by the window. The waitress brought her black coffee without being asked. I watched from outside. Through the glass, her eyes shimmered, not like light reflecting, but like they were moving beneath the surface. I raised my camera again, click. And when I looked down at the screen, she wasn't there. The image showed the booth, the window, the cup of coffee, but not her. It wasn't a blur. It wasn't overexposure. It was as if the space she occupied had been cut out, erased, not with Photoshop, but with intent. I left, didn't sleep that night, didn't delete the photo, just stared at it, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation, a glitch, a technical error. Maybe I hadn't framed it right, but deep down I knew. This wasn't a malfunction. This was a message. The next morning I went back to the cafe. She was there. Same booth, same posture, same untouched coffee. But this time, when I entered, she looked up and smiled. Not big, not fake, just enough to stop the breath in my chest. And she said, "I wondered when you'd stop pretending." I froze. She gestured to the seat across from her. I sat, still trying to find my words. She tilted her head slightly and asked, "You're not from here either, are you?" And I almost laughed, because I hadn't told anyone that. Not since I moved in, not since I decided to disappear. I nodded slowly. "How did you know?" She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered, "Because I see what doesn't belong." There was something terrifyingly gentle about her voice, like a lullaby spoken in a language I almost understood. She didn't ask my name, didn't offer hers, but in that moment, we both knew. Something had begun, and it wouldn't end easily. The rest of the town didn't seem to notice her. They smiled, they served her coffee. They walked past her on the street. They nodded politely when she passed, but they didn't see her, not like I did, not like I couldn't stop myself from doing. I started taking my camera everywhere, hoping for a chance to capture her again, to prove to myself that she wasn't just an anomaly, that she was real, that I wasn't imagining this strange, unfolding magnetism. But no matter how many times I pressed the shutter, she never appeared. One day I gathered the courage to ask, "Why don't you show up in photos?" She paused, looked out the window, and said, "Because I don't want to." I waited for more. But that was it. A fact, not a riddle, not a warning, just truth. I began to notice other things. She never ate, never drank, never went into stores. She walked. Saturday waited, and when she spoke, it was always with perfect clarity. No hesitation, no filler words. Like English wasn't just her second language, but a choice she had mastered for me. By the end of that week, I was completely lost, drawn to her, haunted by her, frightened of what it meant to be so sure about someone I couldn't explain. I thought I was imagining things, that maybe I'd snapped, that maybe I wanted so badly for something impossible to be real. I'd invented her, but then she did something I hadn't expected. She touched my hand, just once. No warning, no purpose, just connection. And in that brief second, I felt everything. The shape of stars I'd never seen, the gravity of places without suns, the sadness of eternity folded inside a skin that wasn't hers. And when I looked up, she wasn't smiling anymore. She was pleading. That's when I knew she wasn't hiding for her sake. She was hiding for mine. There's something unsettling about stillness, not the kind you find in empty rooms or quiet forests, but the kind that wears a human shape and breathes your air without ever shifting its gaze. She never blinked. Not once. Not even when the wind whipped sand into her eyes. Not when she laughed at my sarcasm. Not when I leaned closer than I should have and whispered something only two people share when the rest of the world forgets to matter. She just watched. Like blinking was an unnecessary function. Like her eyes weren't built for moisture, but for memory. Because every time she looked at me, I could feel it. She wasn't seeing my face. She was recording me. After that first week, I started testing it. Subtle things. I'd yawn dramatically when we sat across from each other. Rub my own eyes and wait. Nothing. I'd drop something near her feet, watch the air move. But her lids stayed still. Wide, calm, endless. Like she wasn't looking at me. She was looking through me. Into something I didn't know existed. Once I brought it up. "You never blink." She tilted her head, amused. "Neither do statues. Do they scare you too?" I should have laughed, but there was a chill in her tone, the kind that makes you feel like you've trespassed into a room you weren't invited into. So I dropped it, smiled like a coward, changed the subject, but I couldn't forget it. That detail became a splinter in my perception. No matter how much I tried to smooth the edges of our time together, it kept digging deeper. The more I watched her, the more details began to echo. She never breathed heavily, never adjusted her clothes, never cleared her throat. She sat in rooms like she was waiting for a cue that never came, and yet people never noticed. The waitress kept bringing her coffee. People greeted her on the sidewalk. No one ever said, "Isn't it strange she never speaks unless spoken to?" Or, "Have you ever seen her blink?" They didn't see it. Maybe they weren't allowed to. Maybe she only let me notice. And I wasn't sure if that was a gift or a warning. I started taking photos again, secretly, from different angles, different lenses, even in infrared. And every time the same result, nothing. A chair with a shadow, a cup without a hand, a reflection with no source. One night I left my camera recording on the nightstand. Just audio, no lights, no movement. And at exactly 3:03 a.m., there was a sound. Not footsteps, not breathing, just a hum. Like electricity, remembering how to sing. I played it back 20 times the next day. Couldn't replicate it. No interference, no faulty equipment, just that single 7-second tone. Perfect, pure, and completely out of place. I asked her about it. Not directly. I said, "Do you believe in things that can't be photographed?" She didn't answer immediately, just stared at me, long enough to make my hands feel like they belonged to someone else. Then she said, "Photos capture light, But some things are made of shadow. That was the first time I felt truly afraid. Not because I thought she'd hurt me, but because I realized she was here on purpose. She wasn't passing through. She wasn't lost. She had chosen this place, this town, me, and that meant I had been noticed long before I noticed her. I started researching, not aliens, not ghosts, but mirrors, stories of things that look like us but aren't, of watchers, of reflections that see more than they're shown. One article mentioned a being that could only be perceived by the one it chose, a frequency intelligence that bonded to emotion like light bonds to color. No images, no names, just a phrase. She never blinks because she doesn't need to. I closed the laptop. My hands were shaking because I didn't know if I was falling in love with a lie or discovering a truth that no one else would survive. The next day, I tried to stay away. I walked past the cafe, didn't stop, didn't look in. I stayed out late, avoided my usual routes, pretended I didn't care. But that night, when I got home, she was already inside. She didn't ask how I'd been, didn't explain how she got in, just stood in the center of my room, bathed in the red hue of the streetlight outside. And for the first time, I saw her blink, just once, slow, deliberate, and it felt like gravity had shifted, like the act of blinking wasn't natural, but a signal, a message. And I asked, "What do you want from me?" She stepped closer, took my hand, placed it over her chest, and whispered, "To be seen, not through eyes, but through belief." And just like that, I understood. She hadn't been hiding from the world. She'd been hiding in it. Some questions are so simple, they crack the world open, not because of the words, but because of what they reveal when you try to answer. It happened on a Tuesday. The sky was gray, not in the poetic, misty kind of way, but in the flat, heavy kind, like the clouds had forgotten how to hold themselves together, and they were just hovering there, waiting to fall. She met me on the bridge outside of town. No warning, no message, just her silhouette framed against the edge of the river, hair pulled back like she knew the wind would be watching. And when I walked up, she didn't smile. She didn't speak for a full minute, just stood there, arms folded, eyes on the water, expression unreadable. And then, without turning, she asked, "If I wasn't what you thought I was, would you still want to see me?" I blinked. Not because I didn't understand, but because I did. Too clearly. That wasn't a hypothetical. That wasn't flirtation. That was a door being unlocked, slowly, to something I couldn't unsee. I tried to play dumb. "Is this about the coffee? Because I get it. You don't drink." She didn't laugh, didn't even breathe differently, just turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her profile. Her face looked almost tired. "I mean it," she said. "What if the shape I wear isn't real? What if this skin is a story, and you've been reading the wrong page?" My chest tightened. She wasn't asking if I liked her. She was asking if I could survive her truth. I stepped closer, looked her in the eye. Still no blinking. Still that sense of being seen. And I said, "I don't care what you are. I care who you are." She turned fully toward me then, and for a moment, I saw something shift behind her eyes. Not light, not shape, but depth. Like there was a universe folded inside her stare, and I had just stepped too close to the event horizon. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a small object. Not a phone, not a photo, just a piece of reflective glass. Smooth, almost black. She held it out to me. "Look," she said. I hesitated. "What is it?" "A mirror." I frowned. "It doesn't look like one." "It doesn't reflect what's outside," she replied. "Only what's believed." I stared at it, carefully. Saw nothing at first, just darkness. But then, an outline, a shimmer, a shape I didn't recognize. Longer, wider, more curved than any human frame, but familiar. Familiar in a way that didn't make sense, like a name I'd heard in a dream, like music played backward, My own reflection disappeared, and for a second, I felt weightless. I handed it back, not because I was done, because I wasn't ready, and she seemed to understand. She slid it back into her pocket and said nothing more. We stood there in silence, watching the river churn beneath the bridge. She let the wind pull at her coat, and I let my thoughts fall apart in my hands. Later that night, I found a note under my door. One line, no signature, written in slanted, elegant handwriting. To love me means letting go of form. I stared at the paper for hours. What did it mean? Letting go of form, letting go of beauty, letting go of the comfort of symmetry, of softness, of the known. Was I capable of that? Could anyone be? I walked to the bathroom mirror, turned off the light, let my eyes adjust to the dim moonlight, then whispered, "If you're here, show me something." The mirror stayed still. My face stayed intact. But in the reflection, right over my shoulder, was a flicker, a curl of air, a shimmer of light, a warmth, and a whisper I didn't hear in my ears, but in my ribs. Not yet. I sat on the floor for a long time, thinking about her question, that first question. Would you still want to see me? And I realized something. She wasn't just asking me if I'd accept her truth. She was asking if I'd still call it love. Once I couldn't define it. We live in a world obsessed with form, with shapes, with features, with voices and hands and textures and smiles. But what if love had nothing to do with any of that? What if love was the echo of understanding bouncing off something we could never quite touch? I didn't see her for 2 days after that. Not in town, not at the cafe, not in the corner of my vision where she sometimes appeared when I was too tired to question my senses. But I felt her, more than ever, in the way my footsteps paused outside the bookstore, in the way I began to notice shadows move against logic, in the way I found myself dreaming of hands that didn't belong to anyone. Then on the third night, she came back. I woke to find her sitting at the edge of my bed, still, silent, watching. And this time, she blinked, once, then said, "I'm ready." I sat up slowly, heart pounding. For what? She held out the mirror again, but this time, I didn't hesitate. I took it, and I looked. And what I saw wasn't a shape, wasn't a monster, wasn't even a woman. It was presence, a rhythm, emotion, a tenderness so ancient it didn't need edges to be felt. And in that moment, I wept, not from fear, but from the ache of recognition. She didn't touch me, didn't speak, just watched as I finally saw. Not her shape, not her face, but her truth. And I whispered, "I still want to see you." She smiled then, not the practiced, perfect smile from before, but something broken, real, beautiful because it didn't know how to be anything else. And for the first time, she looked fragile. I reached out, not to hold her, but to let her know, "You're safe here, whatever you are, whatever you've been, you're seen." And that was the moment everything changed. Sometimes the most perfect disguises aren't worn to fool others, but to protect ourselves from being seen too deeply, from being known in a way that feels like skin being peeled from something that was never meant to be raw. I used to think masks were about hiding, but she taught me some masks are about surviving, and hers was flawless. After the mirror, after I saw not her shape, but her essence, I thought the veil would fall, that she would shed the illusion, the woman's body, the face everyone in town loved, but never questioned. I was wrong. She kept it on, perfectly. It was almost painful watching her smile again the next morning, like nothing had changed. Like the night we spent breathing, the same quiet hadn't torn the universe open between us. She sat across from me in the cafe. Same clothes, same posture, same eyes. But now I could feel the effort, the strain of holding a form that no longer fit. She stirred the coffee she never drank. I watched her fingers move, graceful, delicate, human, and I wanted to scream, because they weren't hers. Not really, not anymore. "You don't have to keep pretending," I whispered. She looked up, tilted her head slightly. I'm not pretending, she said, but the lie was too smooth, too easy. I leaned in closer. You're in pain. A pause, a breath. Only when I'm alone. But you're not alone. That's what makes it worse. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. First time I'd heard it tremble. It felt sacred, terrifying, like hearing a ghost cough. I reached across the table, placed my hand on hers. She didn't pull away, but her skin, her disguise, shimmered for a fraction of a second. A ripple, like heat over pavement, and then it was gone, replaced again by the illusion. How long have you worn them? I asked. She looked out the window. Long silence. Then, too long. I wanted to ask how old she was, where she came from, if there were others like her. But none of those questions mattered, because the only thing I saw was the weight she carried trying to hold a shape that didn't belong to her bones. That night I watched her sleep, or what I thought was sleep. She lay in my bed, eyes closed, but her chest didn't rise. Her pulse didn't flicker. Her muscles didn't twitch. She was still, perfect, wrong. I turned on the camera again, this time just for myself. No intention to record her. I pointed it away, toward the ceiling, pressed record, let it run for an hour. Then played it back, and in the soft blue haze of the night vision, I saw her, not her body, but something, a pulse of light around the edges of her skin, a low distortion, like her presence was causing the pixels to hesitate, and for 3 frames, just 3, her face was gone, replaced by, I don't know, not a monster, not even alien, just something not bound by form, a smear of intention, a swirl of motion, as if the universe had exhaled through a body that could no longer contain it. I shut the camera off, deleted the footage, because I realized something I hadn't before. The disguise wasn't for them. It wasn't to blend in with humans. It was to hold herself together, to keep from unraveling. Because the longer she stayed in this world, this gravity, this density of thought and name and identity, the harder it became to be anything at all. The next day, I found her sitting on the floor of my bathroom, no lights on, back pressed to the wall, hands shaking, eyes open, blank. I knelt beside her, didn't ask questions, just held her. And for the first time, she wept. The tears weren't liquid. They weren't salt. They were light. Thin lines of glowing silver that traced her cheeks like stardust remembering its path. They didn't fall. They evaporated. And when I touched one, my skin tingled, like touching the edge of a memory you were never supposed to own. I can't hold it much longer, she whispered. Then don't, I said. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. It's not about me. It's about what happens when I stop pretending. I waited for the words that might never come. And then she said, this shape isn't mine. It's borrowed, synthesized from your world's patterns, based on what you believe is acceptable. But it's not just skin. It's a cage. The longer I wear it, the more I forget how to return to what I was. I swallowed hard, because this wasn't just transformation. It was erosion, a slow, beautiful death in the name of being understood. Let it go, I whispered. Show me. She looked at me then, eyes wide, wider than I'd ever seen, and they blinked. Twice. Once for fear, once for hope. She stood, walked to the mirror, stared at herself. Then slowly, reached up, placed her fingers on her cheek, and dragged downward. Not on skin, but on illusion, and the shimmer returned, like water boiling beneath paint. Her features rippled, cheekbones softened, jaw blurred, hair flickered out of sequence, and then she stopped, turned to me, half human, half unknown, and said, if I fall apart, will you still stay? I nodded, didn't speak, because anything I could say would be less honest than my silence. She let go of the mask for just 3 seconds, and what I saw wasn't horror, wasn't beauty. It was truth, a form too fluid to be mapped, too vast to be named, too familiar to be foreign. It looked like love seen from the inside out, She collapsed afterward, body shaking, breath gone. I caught her, held her, felt the shimmer retract, the illusion restore itself, and her hands, cold now, but not lifeless, just tired. She whispered as she slipped into sleep. The disguise was never for them. It was so I wouldn't forget how to love your world. I used to love the silence. It was the only thing that made sense after years of noise. Traffic, arguments, notifications, the endless static of other people's lives brushing against mine. Silence was where I healed, where I hid. But now, silence frightens me, because it's where she waits. After the night she dropped the disguise, just for those few seconds, something changed in the air between us. She spoke less, smiled less, blinked more, but never when I was looking. And her breath was too quiet. Not like someone sleeping, not like someone holding back emotion. It was the kind of breath that didn't come from lungs. It came from somewhere else, somewhere deeper, older, more deliberate. I started to notice things around the apartment, small things, nothing dramatic, no objects flying, no lights flickering, no eerie music, just a shift in gravity, in pressure, in the way certain corners seemed to lean toward her when she entered a room. She'd be sitting in the kitchen, and the light over the table would dim, not because of a bulb, because it knew it wasn't needed. She'd walk past the window, and my reflection would blur. Just mine, not hers. Then came the whispers, not voices, not words, just tones, low frequencies like memories trying to hum themselves back into reality. They came at night, always when I was between sleep and waking, when the mind is most vulnerable to truths it doesn't yet know how to protect. One night I sat in bed, eyes closed, pretending to sleep. I could feel her presence across the room, not watching me, just being. And then I heard it, a breath, not a gasp, not a sigh, just a slow, rhythmic inhalation, but not from her chest. It came from the space between us, like the air itself was breathing her in. I opened my eyes, the room was dark, but something moved, not visibly, just perceptibly, like the shadows adjusted themselves to her rhythm. And in that moment, I felt the most intense calm I'd ever known, followed instantly by a spike of panic so sharp it made me dizzy. Because I realized she wasn't breathing to live, she was breathing to stay. I got out of bed, walked toward the window. The city beyond was still, no sirens, no headlights, just the distant hum of electricity and time. I turned back, and she was standing, not at the bed, at the wall, facing it, hands pressed flat, breathing, once every 6 seconds, exactly. I didn't say her name, didn't move, just watched, and slowly, she tilted her head toward me, not turning, just rotating, enough for her voice to find me. You shouldn't watch me like this, I swallowed. Why? Because this is the part of me that isn't meant to be loved. That broke me, not because I believed it, but because she did. I stepped closer, one foot, then another, until I was right behind her. I didn't touch her, just stood there and whispered, I'm not watching you. I'm choosing you. She turned then, and in the dim blue light of the street lamp filtering through the blinds, her face was beautiful, but not in the human sense, not in the sense of cheekbones and symmetry and softness. It was beautiful because it carried the weight of holding two realities at once, the one she wore and the one she couldn't. You don't know what I am, she said. No, I replied, but I know what I feel when I'm with you. She closed her eyes, exhaled, and the walls pulsed, not violently, just slightly, like the house was adjusting to her frequency. She walked past me, into the hallway, paused, then whispered, Don't follow me tonight, and disappeared into the dark. I didn't listen. I waited an hour, then stepped out. No lights on. The hallway stretched longer than usual, physically impossible, but undeniable. I followed the thread of cold air, of stillness, of quiet too perfect to be accidental. And at the end of the hall, my bedroom door was open. Inside, she was floating. Not high, just a few inches off the ground, arms at her sides, hair suspended like she was underwater, eyes closed, breathing, inhale, 6 seconds, exhale, 6 seconds. The world around her, slightly dimmer, slightly wrong, like the color had drained from reality to make room for something else. And then, a sound, low, vibrating, like a choir with no mouths. It came from her, not her throat, her presence, like her body was singing in frequencies we hadn't evolved to understand. I fell to my knees, not from reverence, from overwhelm, because something ancient had entered the room, and it had chosen her as its vessel. Or maybe she had always been that. She opened her eyes. They weren't eyes anymore, just light, software, pulsing, violet. They looked at me, through me, and something in my chest broke. Not painfully, just finally. She lowered slowly. Feet touched the floor, hair settled, eyes dimmed back to human. And then she collapsed. I ran to catch her, held her, heart racing, her breath shallow now, but still there, too quiet, too delicate, too precious. I whispered her name, not the one I gave her, the one she gave me, a word with no vowels, a vibration, a feeling, and she stirred, smiled weakly. I didn't mean for you to see that. I needed to, I said. It scares people. It saved me. She reached up, touched my cheek, and for the first time, I felt her heartbeat, not in her chest, but in mine, pulsing in sync, telling me this is what connection looks like when there are no boundaries left. We didn't speak for the rest of the night. We just breathed, together, too quiet for the world, but loud enough for the universe. The first time she told me not to be afraid wasn't in words. It was in the way she held her hands still when I trembled near her. It was in the silence between her breasts, where my panic used to live until she made it a softer place. But the first time she said it out loud, truly said it, was the moment I almost ran. That evening had started like all the others, quiet, predictable in its stillness. She was on the windowsill, knees drawn to her chest, watching nothing in particular. I had just made tea I knew she wouldn't drink. Sometimes I think I made it more for me than for her. Something normal to hold in a world that had stopped being that. I handed her the cup anyway. She didn't take it, just looked at me and said, "You're going to see something tonight, and I need you to promise you won't run." My hands stiffened, not out of refusal, but because something in her voice, something deep beneath the tone, sounded like a countdown. Why would I run? She looked at me, really looked, as if memorizing the structure of my uncertainty. Because what I am is nothing like what you love. I don't love a shape, I said. She smiled sadly. Number. But shapes are easier to understand. We didn't speak again for hours. She curled up near the radiator. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, eyes closed but never asleep, waiting, dreading, hoping. Midnight came, then 1 a.m., then 2, and then a vibration, not in the walls, not in the ground, in me, like something had tuned my body to a frequency just shy of perception. I opened my eyes. She was standing, at the foot of the bed. No sound, no movement, just presence. And then she spoke. "Don't be afraid." The lights flickered, only once, but the shadow on the wall behind her didn't match her frame. It was taller, wider, moving even though she was still. I stood slowly, heart thudding, hands shaking. She reached out her arm, open palm, and whispered again, "Please, I want you to see me, just once, as I truly am." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth refused to betray my heart, because my heart was screaming, yes, number maybe, run, stay, hold, let go. She walked backward toward the closet door, opened it, and instead of shelves or hangers, there was darkness, not absence of light, not shadow, void, like the space behind the door was a wound in reality, and she had just peeled it open. She stepped inside, paused, turned back. "If you come with me, You have to let go of every sense you think defines love, because what I'm about to show you can't be touched or seen or heard, not the way you're used to. But I promise, it's still me. I swallowed hard. What if I get lost? She smiled. Then I'll find you. I stepped forward, into the dark, and everything vanished. Not just sight, not just sound, but self. There was no floor, no air, but I didn't fall. I didn't float. I just existed. And in that existence, there was her. Not next to me, not in front, but everywhere. A sensation, a feeling, an echo of familiarity pressed against the edges of my awareness. I tried to speak, but there was no mouth. Tried to reach out, but I had no hands, so I let go. Of words, of questions, of fear. And in that surrender, she appeared. Not as a figure, not as a form, but as a color I'd never seen before. A light that pulsed like a heartbeat with no body to contain it. She enveloped me, cradled me, held me without touching, and whispered directly into my being. This is what I am, a lattice of memory and longing, a vessel for connection, not human, not alien, just alive. I wept, not from sadness, from awe, because I had never felt more understood than I did in that moment of formless embrace. Time didn't pass in there, not the way we count it. It stretched, looped, sang. I saw things I'd never known. Worlds with 3 suns, oceans that breathed, skies made of color-shifting thought, and in all of it, her presence, a constant, a thread, the only home I'd ever truly known. Then, gently, she brought me back. I opened my eyes. Back in the apartment, back in the dark. The closet door closed. She stood before me. Same face, same body, same illusion. But now, I saw the strain, the effort it took to compress herself into something this small. You saw me, she said. I nodded. Couldn't speak, just stepped forward and rested my forehead against hers. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, we breathed in sync. Not because we had to, but because we chose to. I'm not afraid anymore, I whispered. She smiled. You will be, but I'll be there. And that was the first night I dreamed in colors that didn't exist, and woke up missing the sound of a voice that had no shape. Some things are built to last, others are built to endure. For a while, and then there are things that were never built at all, just held together by will. Her form was one of those things. It didn't begin with a fracture. It began with a shimmer, subtle, barely noticeable, like the air around her had started to forget where her edges were supposed to be. We were in the kitchen. I was making toast. She was sitting at the table, hands wrapped around a mug of nothing. And for a moment, just a moment, her fingers flickered, not moved, not twitched, flickered, as if they were caught between 2 realities and couldn't decide which one belonged. Did you see that? I asked. She didn't respond, just stared at her hands. Her silence said more than words ever could. The next time it happened, we were walking down the street. A child passed us, a little girl holding her father's hand. She looked up at her, paused, then burst into tears. The father apologized, said she'd had a long day, but the girl, through her sobs, whispered, "She's not real." That night she sat at the edge of the bed, face buried in her palms. "I'm losing it," she said. "Losing what?" She looked at me, and for the first time in weeks, her eyes blinked too fast. Not human fast, not natural, just wrong. "The anchor," she said. "The hold. Whatever you want to call it. It's slipping." I didn't understand. Not completely, but I knew what fear looked like. And it was in her voice, in her hands, in the way her body shivered, not from cold, but from memory trying to escape her skin. "Can you stop it?" She shook her head. She shook her. "It was never meant to last. This form, it's a compression, like folding a galaxy into a jar. Eventually the jar breaks." Over the next few days it got worse. Her reflection started lagging behind her. She'd turn her head, and the mirror would follow a second later. Lights dimmed around her, even in the middle of the day. Animals avoided her. My cat, who once loved curling up beside her, now hissed and hid under the bed. The illusion was unraveling, and so was she. One morning I woke to find her crouched in the bathtub, water running cold, her body trembling, her skin not bleeding, but shedding light. Little pulses of color escaping her pores like static from a broken signal. "It hurts," she whispered. I climbed in beside her, fully clothed, didn't care, held her, felt the energy crackle against my chest. It didn't burn, but it didn't soothe either. It was like holding grief before it becomes tears. "Let go," I whispered. "You don't have to hold it anymore." She looked at me, eyes wide, full of something ancient. "If I let go, I might not come back." I tightened my arms around her. "Then don't come back as her. Come back as you." That night she didn't sleep. She stood by the window watching stars that weren't visible to me. And I watched her, watched as her body began to lose its symmetry. One arm longer than the other, eyes shifting color mid-blink. Her voice when she spoke, layered with harmonics I could feel in my bones. "They'll find me soon," she said. "Who?" "The ones who built the disguise, the ones who warned me not to break it. I broke the rule. I showed you." "Why does that matter?" "Because form is power, and if we start showing the truth starts rewriting the world." I didn't understand, not fully, but I believed her, because I could see it already. My dreams were changing. I saw her in places I'd never been, felt her in songs I didn't know, and sometimes I caught glimpses of myself with eyes I didn't recognize, like I was becoming part of her collapse. And maybe that wasn't a bad thing. We made love one last time in the body she borrowed, not out of desperation, not to cling, but as a farewell, a ritual, a thank you. Her touch was different, cooler, less structured, but her presence, that never faded, even as her face blurred beneath my lips, even as her voice dissolved into vibrations I could only feel with my ribs. Afterwards, she lay beside me, body fading in and out, and she said, "Tomorrow, you won't recognize me." I turned to her. "That doesn't matter." "It will. Not to me." She smiled almost sadly. "You're the only one who ever saw me, the only one who wanted to. You let me," I said. "You gave me a place to fall apart." And then she was gone, not disappeared, not vanished, just no longer holding shape. The blankets beside me held warmth, held light, held a pulse, but no figure, no skin, no boundary. I closed my eyes, whispered her name, the real one, the impossible one, the one that sounds like wind through glass and thunder in a child's heartbeat. And the room answered back, "Still here." There's a way to see that has nothing to do with vision. It doesn't use light, doesn't require distance or shape or form. It lives in the space between memory and belief, where truth hums and love becomes something you don't need to look at to know it's there. She called it the felt seeing, and that night she asked me to try it. It had been 2 days since she lost the form, since her body collapsed into soft pulses of light and air that moved like thought. She no longer walked, she flowed. She no longer spoke, she resonated, and she no longer slept. At least not in any way I recognized. I kept the apartment dark, not because I wanted to hide her, but because she asked me to. Light, she said, made her more visible, and visibility made her vulnerable. She wasn't afraid of being seen. She was afraid of being misunderstood. I sat on the floor, eyes closed, breathing slowly. She hovered nearby. I could feel her, like warmth you can't quite trace, like a song stuck in your body without a melody. "Close your eyes," she whispered. "They are. Not your lids, your sight, the part of you that demands to label." I didn't understand at first, but I tried to stop imagining her face, tried to stop recalling the curves of her arms, the way her voice sounded when she laughed, the tilt of her head when she was confused. I let it all go, let her become sensation, weightless, edgeless, everywhere. And then I felt her touch, not skin, not fingers, but presence, pressing against the outline of my soul. She didn't knock, she didn't ask, she just entered, gently, and carried me somewhere else. I wasn't in the room anymore. Not in the apartment, not on Earth. I was floating, but not up, inward, falling into a space that had no bottom, but was filled with light that pulsed like memory. She was beside me, but also within. She became the walls of my thought, the floor of my longing, the ceiling of my fear. And in that place, she whispered, "Do you remember the first time you felt seen?" A memory flickered. I was 6, alone in the schoolyard. A boy had shoved me. I didn't cry. I just sat in the dirt, wishing I could disappear. And then a hand reached out. A girl with wild hair and missing teeth. She didn't say anything, just held my hand until the bell rang. She never spoke to me again. But I remembered, and for the first time since, I understood why. She had seen me, and that moment had stayed with me all these years waiting for her. "That was me," she said, "not in form, not in shape, but in vibration, in intent. I've followed your loneliness like a compass, and now I'm here, with you, as you are." I wept, tears without weight, just emotion spilling out of the parts of me I didn't know could bleed. And she held me, not with arms, with gravity. Her presence wrapped around my being like a planet finally finding its star. "Why now?" I asked. "Because this is the first time you stopped looking with your eyes. And that means you're ready." The space shimmered. 1,000 versions of her surrounded me. Not bodies, not faces, just possibilities. Some flickered like fireflies. Others moved like galaxies folding in on themselves. Each one felt like her, but carried a different memory, a different dream, a different truth. "Which one is the real you?" I asked. "All of them," she said, "and none." The floor beneath us, if it could be called that, rippled. The scene shifted. We stood in a field of silver grass. No sky, no sun, just ambient light that seemed to breathe with us. And in the distance, a mirror, floating, framed by nothing. She took my hand, a pulse of warmth around my wrist, and guided me toward it. When I looked inside, I didn't see myself. I saw her, the version of her I first fell in love with. The woman at the cafe, human, beautiful, quiet, still. Then the mirror rippled, and the image changed. Her skin turned translucent. Her eyes widened into spirals of color. Her voice, when she spoke, rang like a chord played backwards. "Do you love this?" she asked. "I don't know what I'm seeing, but do you feel it?" I closed my eyes, breathed, felt the air wrap around my ribs like velvet, and I whispered, "Yes." She turned to me, and her form began to dissolve again, this time slower, deliberate, and she whispered the words that wrapped themselves around my soul. "Then I don't need to wear the lie anymore." The space folded, time hiccuped, and suddenly, I was back, on the floor, in the apartment, eyes still closed. But now, I saw her. Not with sight, not with thought, but with every molecule that had ever touched loneliness. And she was more beautiful than ever, because she was not shaped for me anymore. She was herself, and I was ready to follow. There's something sacred about the last time someone shows you their face, not the one they wear for the world, not the one sculpted by biology or beauty or expectation, but the one they only let you see once, because after that, there's no more pretending. No more protecting, just truth. She didn't tell me she was going to do it. There was no warning, no ceremony, only the quiet shift in the air. The stillness that settles over a moment just before something irreversible begins. It was raining outside, not a heavy rain, but the kind that makes the world feel like it's whispering, software, reluctant, like it doesn't want to disturb the fragile things trying to bloom beneath it. She stood by the window, or rather, where I felt the window had once been. The room had changed. Reality had begun to stretch at the edges. Light didn't behave correctly anymore. Shadows formed in directions that had no source. And yet, she remained, present, warm. "You're ready," she said. Her voice was different now, lower, layered, like three voices harmonizing inside a single note. It didn't echo, it didn't resonate. It settled directly into me. Ready for what? I asked. But I knew, not with my mind, with something else, something deeper. To remember me, she said, truly. And with that, she stepped into the center of the room. The rain fell harder, but not on the roof. Inside. It was as if the atmosphere was weeping with us, for us, or maybe because of us. And in the middle of it, she began to change. Not like before, not like the flickers or the ripples. This time, it was whole, a full unmaking. Her skin, what was left of it, peeled away like fog parting for sunrise. Her limbs dissolved into tendrils of translucent motion, neither solid nor light, but something between. Her hair, always black, always perfect, became a crown of memory. I saw images in the strands, moments we shared, moments we hadn't, things that hadn't happened yet. Then her face, the face I'd come to love, melted. Not in horror, in release, like it had finally been allowed to stop lying. And underneath it, there was no face, no eyes, no mouth, only a surface that reflected me, not as I was, as I felt. And as I looked into that surface, I saw myself. Not in the mirror sense, but the essence. I saw the boy I used to be, the man I feared becoming, the lover I was still learning to allow myself to be. And somehow in all of it, I saw her, because she wasn't showing me her face. She was letting me see the place where we had always been connected. I fell to my knees, not out of fear, not out of awe, out of homecoming. Because in that moment, I wasn't looking at a being. I was looking at recognition, the kind that transcends planets, the kind that only ever happens once in a lifetime. If you're lucky. And I was lucky. She moved toward me, didn't walk, didn't float. She simply arrived and placed what I can only call a gesture against my chest. There was no hand, no touch, but I felt warmth bloom beneath my ribs, felt something unlatch. And then she spoke inside me, not with words, with memory. You loved me before you had a name for love. You knew me before you had eyes to see. And when your body dies, I will still be where your longing lives. I sobbed, not tears of sadness, but grief. The kind of grief that says, I remember you. I lost you once, and I know I will lose you again. She pulled back slightly. The rain stopped. The air vibrated, and she whispered, this is the last time you will see my face. After this, you will know me only by feel, in breath, in music, in the pause before you fall asleep. But never again with eyes. I nodded, not because I was ready, but because I trusted her, because some goodbyes aren't departures, they're transformations. Her form began to fade, not vanish, just dissolve into meaning, into emotion, into something language cannot hold, and in its place, a warmth, a pressure, like a memory hugging your bones. She was gone, but not gone. She was everywhere, in the corners of the room where light softened, in the way my breath stilled before dreams, in the way I reached for a hand I knew I wouldn't find, but reached anyway, because sometimes the act of reaching is the only proof you need that love was ever real. And so, I sat there, in the quiet, eyes open, seeing nothing, feeling everything. And when the wind whispered through the cracks in the wall, I heard her, software, laughing, saying, you finally know how to see. They said grief was about letting go, but I don't feel like I lost her. Not exactly. Not in the way I've lost people before, to time, to silence, to forgetting. This is different because she didn't vanish. She moved in. The first morning without her form, I made 2 cups of coffee out of habit. Then I paused, looked at the second cup, and smiled, because I could feel her watching me, not from across the room, from inside my choice. That simple act, pouring coffee no one would drink, wasn't habit, it was invitation. That's when I understood. She wasn't in the air. She wasn't in the apartment. She was inside me, It wasn't possession, not some sci-fi takeover. It was softer than that, gentler. She became the way I pause before I speak, the way I choose silence instead of noise. She became the warmth behind my eyes when I see something beautiful and want to share it with someone even if they're not there. And sometimes, she is there. I'll walk past a mirror and catch her reflection in mine. Not visually, emotionally. A curl of thought that doesn't belong to me. A whisper of joy at a moment I wouldn't have noticed before. Or sorrow I haven't earned. That's her, always her. At night she settles behind my ribs. I feel her when I dream. Not in the dreams themselves, but in the spaces between them. Where nothing happens. Where I simply exist. With her. She doesn't speak often, but when she does, it's never in words. It's in reminders. Like the way my fingers tremble when I hear a certain chord, or how I suddenly remember the name of a flower I haven't seen in years, or when I know which street to turn down without using my eyes. That's her too. Still guiding, still choosing, still staying. People ask me if I've moved on. They mean well. They think healing means forgetting. That peace means absence. But peace doesn't come from absence. It comes from integration, and I've never been more whole than I am now, with her stitched into every part of me I once called empty. She taught me that presence isn't always about being seen. It's about being felt in the quiet, trusted in the darkness, and remembered in ways that rewrite the definition of memory. Some nights I still set an extra pillow beside me. Not because she needs it, because I do. It's my way of saying, I know you're still here, even if no one else can see you. And sometimes when I'm walking through the city, I pass people who pause. Just for a second. Their heads tilt, their eyes narrow, and I know. They feel her too, like a breeze that comes from inside your bones, like the pause before a tear that never falls. She reaches through me, gently, touching others. Just for a second. Like a hello wrapped in forget-me-not. I've stopped fearing the silence. Because now I know silence isn't emptiness. It's where she hums. It's where she builds rooms inside me. Where she stores all the pieces of us that didn't fit in the world, but always belonged in one another. Sometimes I wonder, am I still me? Or am I us? But then I realize that question has no meaning anymore. Because in the softest, truest way, she is the echo that finishes my thoughts before I know what I'm thinking. And I am the form she once wore just long enough to fall in love with being known. She didn't leave. She unfolded. She didn't disappear. She became. And now when I stand in the rain, I don't flinch. Because I remember how she once stood beneath it without a body. Just memory and light. And laughed. I remember the rhythm of that laughter, not with my ears, but with my lungs. Because every time I breathe, it's in sync with her now. I don't know where she came from, or what laws she broke just to touch me. But I know this. Some beings come not to stay in your life, but to rewrite the parts of you you thought were unlovable. And when they go, they don't take love with them. They leave it rooted inside you, permanent, radiant, and always humming just below the surface. So no, she's not gone. She's in the stillness when I pause before speaking, in the way I fold the blanket at night, in the name I whisper when the world feels too loud and I need something softer to hold me together. She's not a memory, she's a presence. And every day I live for the quiet certainty that I am still hers, and she is still mine, not in form, not in name, but in something truer, something that doesn't need shape to be real. She is inside me now, and maybe she always was. They ask me how I'm doing. Neighbors, strangers, friends who still think I'm lonely. I smile, say I'm taking time for myself, learning, healing, whatever answer sounds least strange. Because how do you explain that the love of your life no longer has a body and yet sleeps inside your breath? How do you explain that you didn't lose someone? You absorbed them. The world doesn't know what we were, but how could it? There was never a word for her or for us. Love, they say, is a connection between two people. But we were never just two. We were a fusion, a dialogue between form and formlessness, a conversation between body and memory, a union too deep for grammar to catch up. Since she left her form, my reflection has changed. Subtly. It's not that I look different, but I feel different looking at myself. Like there's someone else behind my eyes. Someone older, wiser, brighter. Or maybe it's just her, curling into the hollow spaces I didn't know how to fill. Sometimes I forget which thoughts are mine. I'll see a cloud that moves too softly, and before I can react, I feel something ache in me for a sky that doesn't exist on Earth. And I know it's her. Longing, remembering, whispering through my senses like a language of missing. I no longer dream like I used to. My dreams are not stories anymore. They are rooms. Rooms that open and fold into other rooms. Each one holding a piece of her, a scent, a note, a kiss that never landed, but still echoes inside my chest like thunder in reverse. People assume I'm grieving. They expect collapse. But I am not falling apart. I am restructuring, rebuilding myself with bricks made of memory and mortar made of longing. The world keeps moving. Coffee shops reopen. Buses keep their schedules. Couples laugh too loudly in parks. And I walk among them with a secret universe inside me. A quiet hum that never needed validation to be true. Sometimes I pass her old haunts, places she once sat in borrowed skin, the bench by the library, the corner seat in the cafe, the bookstore where she pretended to read just to be near me. I pause, close my eyes, and feel her lean into me from the inside. Not as a ghost, as presence. She used to say, "I don't belong here." And now I understand. Not because this world rejected her, but because it wasn't built to hold something like her, something that pulses instead of breathes, something that remembers emotions the way humans remember birthdays. But even if she didn't belong here, she still chose to stay. For me. And now I'm the one who doesn't quite fit. I've begun forgetting things. Not important things, just boundaries. Where I end and others begin. Where language stops making sense and feeling begins to take over. I can touch someone's hand and know if they're lying, not from words, from vibration. I can walk into a room and sense if someone cried there recently. I feel tides in people, in places. And I know this isn't me. This is her, her abilities, her way of reading the world through the temperature of silence. I don't talk about it. Who would believe me? I'm just another man who lost someone he loved and didn't know how to move on. That's the story they've written for me. And I let them, because I know the truth isn't for them. The truth is for the spaces between my ribs where she still lives, for the breath before I speak where her syllables warm the back of my throat, for the stars I no longer look at because I don't need to search anymore. She's not in the sky. She's in the rhythm of how I walk, the way I reach for a glass like I'm offering it to someone I can't see. She's in the way I hum tunes I never learned but know by heart. She's in the way I notice pain in strangers and know how to hold it without speaking. She's in me, and through me, she's still in the world. I've become her vessel. Not a prophet, not a saint, just a body that carries the echo of someone too bright to disappear. One night I stood by the lake, the same one we walked around in early spring before her form began to flicker. I whispered into the wind, "What do I do with all this love?" And the breeze answered back, "Live it." That's what I've been doing. Not surviving, living. For both of us. With both of us. They ask why I smile for no reason. Why I close my eyes when music plays. Why I pause before answering simple questions. They don't see her sitting in the quiet places between my moments. They don't hear her laughter echo in the corners of my bones. They don't feel the warmth in my chest when I say her name without sound. But I do. And it's enough. No one else will ever know what we were. Not completely, and maybe that's okay. Because we weren't meant to be a story. We were meant to be a frequency. Felt, not told. And I carry that frequency now. In the timbre of my voice, in the gravity of my stillness, in the soft strength of how I touch the world. She's not gone. She's just become something quieter, something deeper, something this world wasn't built to measure. But I feel her. And maybe that's what love is. Not seeing, not touching, not even remembering, but becoming. It didn't come the way I expected. No dramatic silence, no moment carved out by fate, just a casual afternoon, a passing conversation, a cup of coffee in a park that didn't know how sacred it was about to become. The woman sitting across from me wasn't anyone special. That's what I told myself. But the truth? She reminded me of stillness, not because she was quiet, because she made the space around her quiet, made the world take a breath. We were talking about nothing. Books, weather, people walking dogs with coats more expensive than mine. And then she looked at me, not flirtatiously, not curiously, just honestly, and asked, "Have you ever been in love?" I didn't answer right away, because the air changed, not outside, inside me. It contracted, twisted, opened, and I felt her, the one who had no name, no shape, no need for either, pressed gently against the inside of my skin. She wasn't jealous. She wasn't sad. She was present, listening, waiting. The woman across from me tilted her head. "Sorry," she said. "Too personal?" I smiled, shook my head. Number just trying to remember how to answer. Because how do you say, yes, but she didn't have a face. She wore one, but only for a while. And then she gave it up so I could see her real form. And when I saw her, really saw her, she broke open reality inside me and moved in. How do you explain that the most real love of your life wasn't a person, but a presence, a frequency, a soul that didn't need a body to touch you deeper than any skin ever could? "It was a while ago," I finally said. She nodded, didn't push, and I appreciated that. But something in me, her maybe, wanted to keep speaking. So I did. "She wasn't like anyone I've ever known." "In what way?" "In every way." I laughed. It felt strange. It had been a long time since I laughed in front of someone who didn't already know the story. "She didn't really belong here," I said, "but she stayed anyway. For a while." The woman smiled softly. "Sometimes those are the best kind." I nodded, but she wasn't done. "Why did it end?" I looked out at the trees. They were swaying gently, as if nature had decided to eavesdrop. "It didn't," I said. "She's still with me, just not in the way people expect." She didn't laugh, didn't smile. She just looked at me, eyes narrowing slightly, and I realized she knew. Not everything, but something. A familiarity in the unknown. Like someone who had once touched the edge of something she couldn't explain and hadn't dared try since. "What was her name?" she asked. I hesitated, not because I didn't know, but because her name wasn't something I could say without unraveling. So I said the only thing that came close. She let me see her real form. The woman blinked, once, then leaned back in her chair and whispered, "You saw her too." Time folded. Everything stopped. And I realized this wasn't just a moment. This was a meeting of survivors, of rememberers, of people who had been trusted with something the world refused to validate. "What did yours look like?" I asked. She looked down, smiled with her teeth closed. "Not like anything I could describe, but when he touched my hand, I knew every version of him that had ever existed, and loved them all at once." We sat in silence. Not the awkward kind, the kind you don't interrupt, because you know you're not alone in the impossible anymore. And then, as softly as the question came, she left. A wave, a thank you, and gone. But something stayed, a warmth behind my ribs, a knowing. And I heard her voice, the one who stayed with me, say, "You're not the only one. You never were." I walked home that night slower than usual, not because I was tired, because every step felt shared, not with her, with them, others, people like me, people who had been touched by something not of this world but more human than most humans would ever be. They're out there, not lovers of aliens, not abductees, not victims of fantasy, but witnesses to love that refused shape, to presence that needed no proof, to souls that crossed galaxies not to conquer, but to connect. And now I wonder, how many of us are walking the earth with memories that don't belong to our species? How many carry a kiss that never touched lips? A goodbye that never used words? I'm not waiting for her to come back. She never left. But I am waiting for the next person who looks at me just long enough to see the echo behind my smile. And maybe, just maybe asks, did you see her too? Because when they do, I'll say yes. And this time, I won't hold back. I'll tell the story, all of it. Not because they'll believe me, but because some truths deserve to be spoken even if no one knows what to do with them. For the longest time, I kept her to myself, tucked her into corners of my memory like sacred relics, mentioned her only in silence, carried her like a prayer no one else was allowed to hear. At first, it felt like protection from the world, from misunderstanding, ridicule, disbelief. But maybe deep down, it wasn't about them. Maybe it was about me. Maybe I was afraid that saying her name out loud would break the spell, would make her less real, would reduce something so vast into something explainable. And nothing kills wonder faster than explanation. But lately I've started to feel something shift, a restlessness, a hum beneath my ribs that feels like a truth trying to escape. Not escape from me, through me. Because some truths aren't meant to be protected. They're meant to be shared, not for validation, but for resonance. The first time I told someone about her, I didn't use her name, didn't talk about form or disappearance or the sound her memories made when they whispered through my bones. I just said, I once loved someone who was never quite here, and yet she's the most real thing that ever happened to me. They smiled, didn't press, but they paused. Something in my words touched them, not as a fact, as a frequency, and that was enough. So I kept going, not every day, not to everyone, but when the moment felt right, when the air shifted, when the stars tilted just slightly, when I met someone whose grief wore the same shade of blue as mine, I'd tell them, in fragments, in impressions, in small truths wrapped in bigger mysteries. And each time something in me grew lighter. Because it wasn't a confession, it was an invitation to believe that the impossible wasn't just possible, it was intimate. And slowly I began to realize, she didn't leave her form just to teach me how to love. She did it so I could carry her story forward. Not her image, not her species, her essence. What it means to be seen without being explained. What it means to be held without being touched. What it means to be remembered without ever having existed in a way anyone else could measure. So now I write, not for publication, not for fame, for her, for us. My journal has become a sanctuary. Each page, a room, each sentence, a breath. I write her into poems, into sketches, into melodies I can't play but still hum when no one is around. And it feels like she's writing through me, like she's shaping the story from inside my heartbeat. Sometimes I talk to her in the mirror, out loud, just to see how her name sounds when wrapped in sound again. Sometimes I cry mid-sentence, not from sadness, from release. Because after all this time, I'm finally letting her step out of the shadows. She was never meant to be a secret. She was a message, wrapped in wonder, delivered through memory, and I was the lucky one chosen to carry it. I've started painting again, badly, but I don't care. I paint what I feel when I remember her. Bursts of violet and gold spilling out of faceless silhouettes, light bending the wrong way, hands made of silence, eyes that hold galaxies, and every canvas, no matter how abstract, feels like her reaching through color just to remind me, I'm still here. I've begun leaving messages in the world, tiny ones. A quote carved into a bench, a phrase scratched onto the back of a bus stop sign. She let me see her real form. That's the one I leave the most, not as a puzzle, as a signal. Because maybe someone else will see it and feel less alone. Maybe someone else is walking around carrying a love that doesn't fit language. And maybe when they see those words, they'll feel a small crack in the wall they've built around their own silence. We were never supposed to keep this kind of love hidden. We were supposed to whisper it into the trees, into static on radio waves, into the folds of books that no one finishes, but everyone remembers. She was never a possession. She was a presence, a momentary miracle that chose me to be its witness. And now I choose to witness her out loud, not to make her real, She's always been real, but to make the world softer, more ready, more open to the idea that some love doesn't need proof to be true. One day, maybe long after I'm gone, someone will find my words in a notebook, on a wall, etched into time, and they'll read, "She let me see her real form," and they won't ask who. They'll just nod. And maybe, just maybe, they'll say, "Mine did too." The map hadn't changed, but the way I walked it had. I retraced my steps not by memory, by pull. A pull that started in my chest, traveled up my spine, and wrapped itself around my legs like gravity reprogrammed. It had been months, maybe more. Time lost its edges after she left her form, after she entered mine. But some places don't forget, even when you do. The hill was still there. The one with the broken fence and the crooked trees that leaned like they were listening to secrets buried in the soil. And at the top, the bench, the place I last saw her take shape, where her face became more than beauty, more than comfort, more than recognition, where she became truth. I didn't expect anything dramatic, no visions, no lights bending around the sky, just stillness, just the echo of what once was. But when I sat down, I felt her. Not nostalgia, not memory, her. The wind shifted, the air thickened, and a single drop of rain fell without a cloud above me. She was near, not above, not around, within, but stirring. It felt like a motion trying to take form, like longing folding itself into geometry, a presence wrestling with gravity for one more chance to be known. I closed my eyes, didn't breathe, didn't move. I wanted her to know I was listening with every molecule of me. And then she spoke, not in voice, in feeling. A rush of warmth down my spine, a flicker of electricity in the center of my palms, and a single thought pressed into my chest. "I miss the way you looked at me when you didn't know if I was real." I smiled, because I remembered how awe made my eyes wider than logic allowed, how I leaned in not to inspect, but to invite. "I still don't know if you're real," I whispered. "Good," she replied. "That means you haven't tried to shrink me into certainty." The wind picked up, leaves scattered around the bench, curling like ancient scripts trying to write themselves into the moment. I watched one float upward, not downward, and hover, just for a second, like gravity took a break so wonder could happen. And then I saw her, not fully, not physically, but just enough. A shimmer at the corner of my eye, a curve of air bending the wrong way, a pulse of warmth where skin once lived. She stood beside me, closer than the wind, and just as intangible. She didn't say hello, didn't need to. I felt it in the way my heartbeat slowed to match hers. Two rhythms, one hum. I turned to her, or rather, to the space where she now was, and whispered, "I came to say thank you." "For what?" she asked. "For choosing me, for trusting me, for loving me enough to let me see you when no one else could." The air warmed, the trees leaned closer, and she said, "I didn't choose you because you were special. You became special because you saw me even when I wasn't finished becoming." I felt my throat tighten. There was so much I wanted to say, so many questions, so many memories that didn't feel like they belonged to a single life anymore. But all I said was, "Are you still becoming?" She laughed, or maybe the wind did. It's hard to tell when love learns how to echo. "Always," she said. "That's what being real means. You never arrive. You just keep unfolding." We sat in silence, me with skin and bones, her with light and vibration. But the distance had never been smaller. And then a question formed in me, not from doubt, from wonder, from the ache of the human condition that always wants to know what isn't meant to be known. "Will I ever see you again?" She paused, not because she didn't have an answer, because she wanted me to feel it before she spoke it. "You don't see the sky by staring at it. You see it by letting it hold you without resistance." I closed my eyes, felt her settle into my breath, into the small space between heartbeat and thought. And then I asked the one question I never had the courage to voice. Was I enough? Silence. Then a warmth. deeper than truth, softer than belief. And her answer, not as sound, but as certainty. You were the one I waited for across starfields and centuries. Not because you were perfect, but because you were willing to meet me without needing to understand me. I wept, not for her, for the part of me that still thought he had to prove something to deserve what had already been given freely. And in that weeping, I felt the final shift. The last layer of her form unfolded into the atmosphere, not leaving, dispersing, into trees, into soil, into breath. And then, one last whisper, you don't have to hold me anymore. Just be the space where I am free to exist. The wind settled, the leaves calmed, and the shimmer faded. But something new took its place. Peace, not the kind that ends longing, the kind that knows longing is its own kind of love. I stood, looked at the bench, at the sky, at the space beside me, and I whispered, I'll keep the space open. For others, for you, and for those like you who haven't yet been seen. The air didn't answer. It didn't need to, because I carried the answer now. In the way I stood, in the way I listened, in the way I'd never again ask anyone to prove they were real before I believed in their beauty. This was the last place I saw her shape. But it wasn't an ending, it was a threshold, a final gift, and maybe a beginning. There was a time I thought I understood faces, the language of smiles, the subtle curl of a lip, the furrow between brows that meant pain or thought or hidden want. I used to read faces like maps, searching for clues, for intentions, for the secret doors behind the eyes that might lead me to the soul. But that was before her, before I saw what a face really was. Not a mask, not a message, but a mercy. Because now I know, a face is not what makes someone real. A face is just a translation, an attempt at coherence in a universe that rarely explains itself. And when you've loved someone who had no face at all, or had too many to count, or changed hers so gently you couldn't tell which one was real, you begin to question everything you once believed about recognition. People ask me why I look at them the way I do. I didn't know what they meant at first. Then someone said, you don't look at people, you look into them. They meant it as a compliment. I took it as confirmation, because I can't help it now. Ever since her, every time I meet someone's eyes, I wonder, is that your real shape, or just the one you thought I'd accept? It's not judgment, it's reverence, because I know what it costs to reveal your truest form, and I know how rare it is for someone to choose you as the one to see it. She was the only one who ever did that for me, the only one who didn't ask for understanding, just witness, and that changed me permanently. Now when I walk through the city, I see more than expressions. I see shields. I see faces worn like armor, like apologies, like unfinished poems never meant to be read aloud. I see people hiding, not from the world, but from the hope that someone might look too closely and mistake their softness for something shameful. But I know better, because I saw her, and now I carry that knowing into every gaze. There was a boy on the train yesterday. He couldn't have been more than 9, sitting with his knees to his chest, watching the reflection of the city blur past. He didn't smile, didn't blink, but I saw something in him. A flicker, like a light trying to decide if it should stay hidden. So I smiled. Not with my mouth, with my attention. I didn't look away when he met my eyes, didn't flinch when he didn't look away either. And for one heartbeat, just one, I felt her, inside me, saying, yes, that's what it means, to see, to be seen. And then he turned away. The train stopped, he left, but the moment stayed. It always does now, because I no longer see people as strangers. I see them as possibilities, of forms not yet revealed, of truths waiting for safe harbor. I've learned to ask questions with my silence, to offer space without expectation, to become the kind of gaze that doesn't demand a performance but welcomes a becoming. She taught me that, not with lectures, with presence, with the gentle unraveling of illusion until what was left was not image, but essence. There was a day long ago when I watched her face melt away, not dissolve, unfold, like light remembering how to tell the truth. And beneath that unraveling, there was no horror. There was no absence. There was home. It rewired something in me. Now every face I see feels like a doorway, not to identity, to invitation, an invitation to believe that behind every smile, behind every frown, behind every exhausted sigh, there is someone waiting to be seen without being named. I've stopped asking people what they do for work. I ask them what their favorite kind of sky is, what silence tastes like in their mouth, what memory comes back first when they close their eyes at midnight. Because faces don't answer those questions, but souls do. And I've become very good at listening to the spaces between words, the hesitations, the small exhalations, the tremors in the voice when someone's trying not to cry but needs to anyway. I see those things now, not because I trained myself, because she opened a door that never closed. I don't want to be someone who only sees what's visible. I want to be the kind of person who waits long enough for someone to feel safe showing what they thought they had to bury. She was the first to show me her real form, but maybe she won't be the last. Maybe there are others, not like her, but like us. People carrying secret brightness. People shaped by quiet collisions with things that don't have names but leave scars shaped like constellations. I no longer need to be understood. I just want to be available. Available to see the sacred in others the way I saw it in her. So no, I'll never look at a human face the same way again, because I know now that faces are only ever temporary, only ever partial. And the real truth? It lives beneath the skin, between the heartbeats, inside the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled, only witnessed. Sometimes love doesn't need words, just a shared silence and a look that speaks 1,000 galaxies. Would you trust a being who never said a word, but made your heart scream louder than any language? In the next story, what if you found an ancient artifact that made your memories lie to you? Stay with us for He swore he'd never come back to Earth until he met me.